We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not.
Hello and welcome to episode 30 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Dan Heaton and my partner in podcasting today is Mike Swadling, the co-founder of the Croydon Constitutionalists. Another week in lockdown. How are you feeling, Mike?
Well, hay fever season has hit me, which is a great disappointment, but it's another sunny day. We can now go out in groups of 30 or 40. I might be interpreting what I'm seeing on the street rather than what's in the law at the moment. But yeah, it feels like the world is slowly getting back to normal, although without the pubs, I think nothing's truly normal.
Well, I'm delighted to say that we're joined on the podcast today by Alasdair Stewart, the former chairman of the Croydon Conservative Federation. Alasdair, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much.
How are you coping with the lockdown at the moment?
Well, I am definitely very much ready for lockdown to be eased and definitely finding a nice beer garden or something like that to drink a few pints and catch up with friends. I really do hope that we can hurry up and get to that position. I think just with all the nice weather and as has been said, it does seem that people are interpreting everything quite liberally at the moment, which is a great thing. I think we probably can all be trusted to use our common sense and follow some simple guidance. So the sooner we get back to everything being open to normality, I think the better everyone will really feel.
Sounds good to me. So, Mike, what have we got to discuss on the podcast today?
So we're talking about COVID-19 and some of the headlines around that recently. Some more Brexit news with our regular Operation Cheer. Croydon Council's worrying financial troubles. The US presidential campaign, which is fast coming at us. And some things you can do to stay busy.
Excellent. Yes. So COVID-19, it continues, but from Monday we can meet in groups of 6. Outside, I believe, so you can't just go around to someone's house, but that might be different in different parts of the country. Time will tell. And apparently in a couple of weeks' time, non-essential shops will start to reopen. So looks like some progress is being made. However, our friends at the BBC take a slightly different position. They've been interviewing a chap called Professor John Edmonds of the LSE, who is suggesting that the scientists would like to keep the whole place locked down and that the moves to ease the restrictions are a political decision. So far, the scientists and the government seem to have been hand in glove, but there seems to be some dissension now. Mike, it's not like scientists to not care about the economy.
No, indeed. When you're living off a fat reimbursement from a university, you don't really need to worry about things like the plebs working and securing an income, do you? I saw a headline on the BBC today that said there's a risk to opening up, and it's like, yeah, that's right. There's a risk to waking up in the morning. There's a risk to going to sleep at night. There's always a risk. Life is about balancing risks, as we all know. We've already mentioned going down the pub. Look, there's clearly not the bright solution to go and have a drink, but it is also the solution that makes life bearable for many people. But so if the rate of infection is dropping, the number of deaths are thankfully dropping. The BBC and the scientists who are protected from the reality of the working world don't need to be listened to balance your risk, but it does feel like the probability now is we need to get back to this. And I was only partly joking about the groups of 30 I see hanging around. This lockdown's ended. It's whether the government decides to change the rules or not. It's ended.
So, Alasdair, is the lockdown over for you?
Sadly not, no. I do try and follow the rules as much as possible, but I am very glad that the politicians are leading ahead and not just following one very narrow interpretation of the science. I think that's exactly why we have politicians. They should be balancing not only the immediate health risks, but the impact on the economy and the longer term repercussions of keeping us in lockdown, not just on education. And we know that there's huge potential implications there for our children who aren't in school at the moment, and particularly in those from poorer backgrounds who don't have the stay-at-home mum or stay-at-home dad to provide, fulfilling and educational activities all day, every day, but also people's long-term health. We know there's huge impacts both on mental health and also other issues where people aren't getting treatment for cancer and other conditions at the moment. So I'm really glad that we're not just following one very narrow interpretation. And while I'm sure a couple of scientists are providing the BBC and others with some perfect media fodder that they can whip up, lots of opposition and everything too. I am rather glad we got saner heads prevailing at number 10 and finding a better balance through this.
Well, speaking of people at number 10 and their the way the media has looked at their interpretation, shall we say, of the guidelines, we've had the debacle of Dominic Cummings over the past few days. He decided to go up to Durham to his family home, which is a farm, so he was able to socially distance, as it were, from his parents at the time. But it seems like the media have been out to get him over the past week, even when it was explained that it was an interpretation of the rules, and Durham police seem to think that it's not a problem. Now, of course, Dominic Cummings was the guy behind the Vote Leave campaign, so it's possibly the case that there are some media and political people in there who are out to get him, perhaps. And one of them may be Emily Maitlis of the BBC, who opened up Newsnight the other evening with her own political opinion by the look of it. The BBC did have to roll back from that, and she was stepped down from the following evening. But it's another case of the BBC putting out its version of events rather than looking at what's actually been going on. Mike, how's the BBC dealing with this?
It's dealing with it the way, unfortunately, the BBC has dealt with most things since the referendum. They were generally widely credited of balancing the actual referendum campaign quite fairly. I don't particularly remember that because, to be honest, as you know, Dan, pretty much every waking hour we were out leafleting or street stalling or having a public meeting or generally rabble raising. But since then, clearly they were unhappy with the result. Clearly they don't accept the result, and clearly they will push back at the result at every opportunity. I'd sort of use the phrase a lot on the social media, BBC Remain, and when I first started using that, you'd see sort of tweets and Facebook posts take off. I have some sympathy with those concerned with Dominic Cummings' actions. I think it's generally unwise to have a very strong message to do one thing, and then because you know the rules in very great detail, you can get round it and you can do your own thing. Now, I was speaking to a couple of lawyers on here, and you know, you guys might be used to knowing the detail of a rule or a law and knowing ways through them. I don't think the vast majority of us are, and it kind of feels like because Dominic Cummings was in the know, he took advantage, sorry, that's the wrong thing, because he stayed within the rules, but he was able to do certain things because he was in the know that most of us weren't. And then suddenly the media comes down the track and you think, do you know what? I don't really care what Dominic Cummings done. I know this is a battle for Brexit, and I'm always going to be on Dominic Cummings' side on that one.
Alasdair, what have you made of it?
Well, I think there's a huge issue very much there around the difference in what was in the actual legislation versus what the government put out in the guidance. And I think just one of the simplest illustrations of that was that we would continually hear that we were allowed out once a day for exercise. And we had Michael Gove saying it should be about an hour, not any longer than an hour. but that was never in the law. People were going around widely quoting restrictions like this, but that was never actually in the legislation or regulations that were passed. And quite frankly, it's been a bit of a mess. And you expect there to be some mess in this sort of fast-moving situation. But you would also hope that, given we're now 10 weeks in, yes, it might have been really rushed and things missed in the beginning, but we're at a point now where the government could have corrected that and could actually have the legislation and guidance matching up. And my real concern is that when you have these kind of problems, we've got the legislation saying one thing, we've got politicians and others saying, here's some guidance and that's something else. And we've got the likes of the police saying, and here's our guidance when we're going to issue fines and what we're going to do and how we're going to behave. And none of them match up. So I think a huge number of people across the country will have inadvertently found themselves breaking the rules, or indeed, like Dominic Cummings, found a way to read into them different things that people wouldn't think is certainly within the spirit of the rules, but is certainly within the letter of the rules, and that's never a very good or great place for our country to find itself. I really do think that our country should be better than that. And talking about the media, well, I think they've done a huge disservice throughout this entire crisis, really. You only need to watch the daily briefings. They are far too interested in wanting to score points against the politicians and catching them out, rather than asking some intelligent questions that would genuinely provide some useful information that would benefit the public. And I'm afraid to say I've not watched Question Time or Newsnight in quite some time, because it has just been so unbalanced, both in terms of the presenters, who clearly have their own political persuasion that they are pushing, but also in terms of the people they invite on. It continues to amaze me that on Question Time, they maybe every now and then get two people that supported leave on there, and it's normally one a week versus four remainers. And I'm sorry, for a country that voted 52% to leave, it should be possible for them to find a better way to balance all their panels. So from my point of view, it's just been a huge disservice, and I think the polling that's coming through has shown that people now trust the media less than politicians, and that clearly can't be a very sustainable place for something like the BBC to continue forcing us all to pay a licence fee every year. The public just won't accept it going forward.
Melissa raised a really good point there around BBC Question Time and what have you. Guido Fawkes has done a poll this week, Emily Mattis' Twitter account, and how many tweets had been neutral, how many had been anti-Boris, and how many had been pro-Boris, and it was 98%. Now, the majority were neutral, and there were simple things like, we're interviewing, famous person later. But of those that were politically about Boris, 98% were against and 1% was in favour. They're not even trying to hide it, and that's the most shocking thing. Question Time, we've spoken before, and I know we've published stuff on the website about how biased Question Time panelists have been. Exact point Alice has just raised. They're not even trying to hide it. They're not even trying to fix it anymore, and that's it's bad enough when they get it wrong. There's a point where you might be getting it wrong legitimately. There's a point where even if you might be biasedly getting it wrong, and there's a point where you've been caught out and you can't even be bothered to do anything about it. Just it's quite worrying that they just don't even seem to think they need to pretend to be impartial in some ways.
The media's not come out of this very well at all. But on a lighter note, and some pleasing stuff, the sport is coming back. In Germany, the Bundesliga started up a week or two ago, and this weekend the National Rugby League in Australia started back up. So what's this got to do with Dominic Cummings? Well, Dominic Cummings not only made his way up to Durham, apparently within the rules, but he was spotted at one of the National Rugby League games over the weekend. What's happened is that the games are taking place behind closed doors, but if you pay, I think it's 22 Australian dollars, you can send a photograph in and they'll make a life-size cutout of you and put it in the seats. Some funny person's gone and sent in a picture of Dominic Cummings, and there's a cutout of Dominic Cummings on television there. All the games are being shown on Sky this weekend because they've got nothing else to show. So Dominic Cummings there was in Sydney over this weekend. Interestingly, first reported in the Hull Daily Mail, that bastion of free speech, but the Guardian has now finally picked up on it. So Mike, you've got to applaud this person for the comedy value of that.
You might as well get hung for mutton as for lamb. There's no point driving to Durham if you can't also take in a rugby league game in Australia at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, on another cheery note, the Brexit trade talks may be bumbling along at the moment, but there's been some good news for people up in Sunderland, at least, in that Nissan is in fact going to keep the factory open, and they're going to go back to work shortly and make more cars. Not so good news for the plant in Barcelona, which is going to be closed. Mike, I seem to recall being told that companies like Nissan were going to close down the plants in places like Sunderland, and they were going to move all the car manufacturing onto the continent. Doesn't seem to be the case.
Dan, are you referring to closing down Sunderland because of Brexit, or are you referring to closing down Sunderland because we're not joining the Euro? I can't remember which time the globalist groups had said Sunderland was going to close down, that we're coming back to now. It's fantastic news for Sunderland. It's fantastic news for British manufacturing and our economy in a wider sense. Clearly, if you have a competitive workforce, a productive workforce, people will invest in your country, and that's great news. And there's wrong on so many levels, Project Fear at every turn, and it's good to see the side that keeps on getting it wrong.
They do keep on getting it wrong. So, Alasdair, good news for British manufacturing there.
Oh, excellent news for British manufacturing, and I think Mike is spot on. We've had all these doom and gloom stories that if we didn't join the Euro, if we didn't do this, if we left the EU, that all of a sudden everything would come crashing down. But markets adapt, consumers adapt, suppliers adapt. The people running businesses are very intelligent people, and if there's a way to make money, they'll keep doing it. So it's great news for Sunderland. But I think one of the things for me is it also just illustrates again how out of touch our media is, because we've heard hardly anything about it. Considering how much it was covered in the run up to the referendum, that car jobs were at risk, Sunderland was at risk, Nissan was going to leave Britain and, pull it all back either to the EU or to Japan. Barely any attention or time has been given to it on media programs. I think that just illustrates it's not just the presenters of these programs which are expressing their political views, but those who are producing and editing them as well. They are choosing deliberately not to highlight these stories to people, despite the fact they highlighted it when it did meet their view of the world in terms of their politics. So great news for Sunderland, but sadly yet another bit of bad news for the media.
Indeed, some good economic times there coming for Sunderland. Less so in Croydon by the look of things, though. We mentioned on the last podcast that there was going to be an emergency meeting with the Croydon Council and the possibility of a Section 114 order being issued due to the little matter of £1.5 billion of debt that our council has managed to get itself into. Well, we understand that they have managed to avoid, for now, issuing a Section 114 order. However, the chief executive, Jo Negrini, of fame for her lavish salary, has in fact said that there's going to be a further financial review and an immediate recruitment freeze and halt on non-essential spending, which is in fact the same thing that you would have to do if you'd issued a Section 114 order. Looks like there's going to be some cuts in services and council tax rises on the way then. Mike, not good news for Croydon Council taxpayers.
£217,194 is the Jo Negrini salary that you alluded to there. There's going to have to be some cuts in services and tax rises, as you say. The services I might wonder if they might cut are the services provided to the 23 people that earn over 100 grand. Up 4 on last year. I know we mentioned this last week, but it bears repeating. The London Borough of Barnet, which is roughly the same size as us, have just 7 staff and over 100 grand. That's 16 less than we have. I wonder what those 16 people are doing. Sutton has just 11. Bromley has 20, close, but not quite the same level. If you go southwards into Surrey, they have far, far fewer. I worry, and I suspect that's exactly not where the cuts will be made. I would say what they've been paying out on over £500 so far this year, Croydon, but I can't because they haven't released the payment details since January. They've released January's numbers, but none since. I have chased them up for it, but not only are they overspending, they're not actually competent at doing their job. And another example of that, and the Conservative Party this last week have put out some very effective online adverts about businesses that are not getting their grants that they're meant to be getting. If you look at all of the boroughs in the country, all of the unitary authorities, Croydon Council is in both the bottom 10% for the amount of grants paid out versus the grant they've been given, and the volume of grants versus the number they've identified. They're not getting the basics right. They're not delivering for the people of Croydon, and they're super expensive at the same time. It's like a perfect cluster of something that I wouldn't want to say in a family podcast.
Not looking good for us council taxpayers, is it, Alasdair?
No, it really isn't. And I'm sure many people in Croydon can remember I think it was the 23% increase in council tax that Croydon Labour had to push through the last time the council's finances got into this kind of terrible state. And what we're seeing in Croydon is really just sadly an example of what we typically see in the national level, where Labour get voted into Westminster, make a mess of the finances, and the Conservatives are eventually voted back in to fix it. Well, for Croydon, I don't think that can come soon enough. If you look next door at Bromley Council, they don't have a single penny or pound of debt. And that means they're not paying millions and millions of pounds every single year in interest. And they're able to spend much more money on our libraries, keeping our potholes filled, making our streets look nice, and, just delivering the vital public services that local people need and want. So it's just a complete mess. And you really do wonder that when we have so many people on such high salaries, why we aren't able to attract better people for those roles. And clearly, if the money isn't bringing us in competence, well, we should stop paying the money. Let's pay less. Let's get people in who actually want to be there and hopefully can start doing better things for Croydon.
Of course, the Labour Party, they retained the majority on the council back in 2018. There's due to be another election in 2022. But before then, it's quite possible that there'll be a referendum on the concept of a democratically elected mayor for Croydon, so that the whole structure of Croydon Council may change. Sounds like Tony Newman is now expecting, that's Tony Newman, the Labour leader of Croydon Council, is apparently now expecting there to be a referendum next May, and the Labour Party is expected to formally oppose that concept. That's despite the fact that it's actually Labour Party's national policy at the moment to devolve power and to have things such as elected mayors. And indeed particularly strange given that the Shadow Secretary of State for local government is in fact Steve Reid, the Croydon North Member of Parliament. Mike, you've been doing some work with Democ before the coronavirus hit and the campaign had to go into lockdown like the rest of us. Going to be interesting, this one.
It is. I should declare an interest. I'm actually on the committee for Democ and have been campaigning with them. The Labour Party in Croydon's interesting. There are three parties: Croydon South, Croydon Central, and Croydon North. Croydon South has shown support for the campaign. And we've had people speak at public meetings and attend events. So that's important to understand. And other parties support us. Christian People's Alliance, Libertarians, Brexit Party, all locally have provided support. But most importantly, because it's a residents-led campaign, lots and lots of residents associations have supported it. Yes, will there be a referendum? Don't know. Don't know quite how it will pan out, but it's highly likely, judging by the number of signatures we'd had not that long ago. But we're not all completely checked out and ready to say or verified at this stage. Yes, I don't get the sense that Steve Reid is batting for Tony Newman, and who can blame him on that one? It's going to be a time of change in Croydon, not just because of the disaster that the council has kind of turned out to be. But we do need some accountability. It only underlines the fact we need some accountability in Croydon Town Hall. And I certainly believe a democratically elected mayor will give us that.
Alasdair, what are your thoughts on the whole concept of the democratically elected mayor for Croydon?
Well, I hope it could be a really good thing, because I think what we continue to see in Croydon is that, when Labour win control of the council, everyone feels they only listen to their voters in the north that deliver them the seats, and similar complaints were levied against the Conservatives when they were running the council, where they were only focused on the south of the borough. So anything that hopefully motivates the elected mayor to think of the whole borough, I think would be good for local democracy, but also good for local residents. And absolutely, I think clearly Labour in South Croydon, who are supporting the campaign, clearly feel as ignored as residents in South Croydon do by Croydon Council. So I really do hope that the petition gets the right number of signatures, it gets in, and we have that referendum next year, and hopefully see some real change to how things are run and done in Croydon. But I think the one thing that I worry about is, who are the mayoral candidates going to be? I don't see anyone on either the Conservative or Labour council front benches who I think could make a real strong appeal across the whole of Croydon. And I really do worry that we're going to end up with a rather boring, bland, and a really unenthusiastic candidate that really can't bring the change to Croydon that I think we so badly need.
One thing we've talked about previously, Mike, was the idea of moving staff from Bernard Weatherall House out to the suburbs of Croydon, and having them work in those areas, thereby helping to help business in those suburban places. Well, it looks as if our plan might be coming to fruition because of the social distancing requirements. Reports are coming out of the town hall that staff are going to be placed in libraries. You're not the mayor of Croydon, are you, Mike?
Apparently, it may well be. Now, listeners could be forgiven for not knowing what Dan's alluding to, but this was in fact UKIP party policy in Croydon in the 2018 local election. Unfortunately, we were maybe not as successful as making that clear as we'd have liked to have been, but we talked about moving jobs out of town hall, moving them to the local high streets, creating good, well-paying jobs in local high streets, putting offices in there, people to use sandwich shops, news agents, coffee bars, whatever it might be, helping those high streets. And certainly when I think it's fair to say I helped propose this, and I wasn't alone, but within the local branch at the time, my feeling was that if you had some of these lavishly paid executives working in Thornton Heath High Street, we might see some investment in Thornton Heath like we've seen in Croydon Town Centre. If you had them working in New Addington or Purley High Street, you might see them get to understand these local areas in a way that is pretty clear to me. They come in from Surrey quite often. They go straight into the town hall. Maybe they get the train, and they wander between East Croydon and Catherine Street, and they don't really see the borough writ large. And if they had to work in your local library, things might change, and their view of the borough might change. Yeah, fantastic news if this has come in, even if not necessarily for fairly horrible reasons in terms of the need to social distance. But yeah. You wait around long enough and everyone's going to eat your policy, Dan, aren't they?
Absolutely. Leaving the European Union and moving jobs out to the suburbs of Croydon. It's a victory, as it were. Well, speaking of victories, as it were, obviously Donald Trump was the successful presidential candidate back in 2016. And so there's going to be another election later this year. Some developments in the presidential campaign have been taking place over recent months. Bernie Sanders, the near enough communist potential candidate for the Democratic Party, he stepped down in favour of Joe Biden, the former vice president. And of course, Donald Trump has said that he will be running for re-election. Well, something that the BBC hasn't picked up on particularly is the Obamagate. Now, I don't know whether you've heard about this, Mike, But it seems to be Donald Trump's response to the attempt to impeach him last year over the concept of the collaborating with the Russians. The suggestion is that in between the election in November 2016 and the inauguration, that then still President Obama was basically spying on the Trump campaign and the people that Trump was looking to bring in. Could make life interesting. What's your take on it, Mike?
I had heard of Obamagate, and then when you try and Google it and find some information out, it's just to prepare for talking about it here. It's very hard, and it's very hard to get anything that's not just sensationalist on either side, and anything that lacks any detail, or anything that has any detail. And then I sort of remember the whole Russian interference piece that came along, and the Brett Kavanaugh affair, and it does seem like another in a line of one on the Republican side this time, but a media-dominated, sensational sort of driven accusations, no sort of detail, lacks facts, means different things to different people, trying people without actually giving evidence or going to court or, doing those kind of rather useful justice things. And Obamagate just feels like another chance of getting two sides up against each other. So, it's just at the start of the campaign, and this thing's only going to get worse.
Yeah, it's almost as if there's the good guys and the bad guys, and no matter what the facts are, you'll believe whoever you believe are the good guys. Alice, obviously you've been involved in politics in Croydon, where there's a pretty divided setup between Labour and the Conservatives. What's your take as someone who's been involved in British politics on what you've seen in American politics over the last few years?
Oh, I mean, that is just such a difficult question to answer in any sort of short period of time. But I think the one thing that we can always safely say is that no matter how much people on different sides of political spectrums or arguments in the UK might complain about the state of UK politics, when you compare it to the USA, well, they're in an entirely different league altogether. And we do, at least in the UK, have other parties like the Liberal Democrats who grew and suddenly shrunk an awful lot, but also parties like UKIP and the Brexit Party, which can have huge influence on British politics despite never actually winning that many seats or that many votes. And looking at America, it is just such a mess. And thinking about a country of 350 million people, looking at the two candidates in the last presidential election, you had Trump and Hillary, are they really the best two people that the two parties could come up with? You just wonder how they end up in this kind of mess. And again, looking at the two candidates this time around, well, I don't think I could vote for either of them. And I really just feel sorry for, our American friends across the pond that's the really poor choice that they've been given. I really wouldn't know what to do in that kind of circumstance.
Indeed, and the guy going up against Trump this time, it would appear to be Joe Biden, the former vice president, who you'd think would be, looking to bridge that divide. Well, he was recently interviewed this week on a syndicated radio show that goes across the country called The Breakfast Club, the host of which is a chap called Charlemagne the God, which is an interesting a name to obviously to give yourself. And on that show, Joe Biden actually said the following: if you have a problem figuring out whether you're going to vote for me or Trump, then you ain't black. Funnily enough, people took some umbrage with this, and he did later express some regret and said that he maybe had been a bit cavalier. Mike, for all the criticism that President Trump gets for his coarseness, shall we say, extraordinary statement from the person who's going to go up against him.
Joe Biden's got form on this. Joe Biden has a famous speech where he puts on a southern, and I can only describe it as an African-American accent, and says they're going to put you all back in chains. And talking about Mitt Romney. Now, Mitt Romney, who most Republicans, most conservatives, or many Conservatives would say, really, frankly, isn't very. And he won in New Hampshire, I think, somewhere where, or maybe it was Massachusetts, somewhere you have to be a bit more centre ground, and he'd done that very well. To describe him as effectively trying to describe him as a slave master, as Joe Biden did, it does show he's got form. He's not very interested in. He's not interested in creating harmony. He is interested in creating division. It's probably, sadly, with Joe Biden, I think what might become a theme of this campaign, it's one of the things he seems to have premeditatedly said. One of the few things. Joe Biden's 77. He's older than Donald Trump. If you try and see him string 2 or 3 sentences together, they don't work well. I might be accused of that myself sometimes, but I'm not running for president. He's an old man, and it's coming across, and it's a really sad thing to mention that. And it's the sort of thing I don't want to mention, because we're all going to hopefully be 77 one day. But someone should have tapped him on the shoulder and said, your time has passed. It could be a very embarrassing election for the Democrats in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, Alasdair, can you imagine a leading British politician coming out with a statement like that? Sorry, apart from Diane Abbott, but can you imagine anybody else coming out with a statement like that?
No, and I think it really puts into perspective, the sort of media excitements that we have in this country, whether it's Ed Miliband's bacon sandwich photo and moment, which everyone couldn't stop talking about, or Gordon Brown's bigoted woman comment being picked up on the microphone. These pale in comparison to what is happening in America, both from Biden and Trump, and it really makes me very happy and glad that as much as we might complain about most of our politicians in Britain, they're at least in a quite different league to what we see in America.
Well, you mentioned a little while back, Alasdair, that you wouldn't know who to vote for if you were presented with the 2 candidates. Well, I can tell you there is a third, because Jo Jorgensen has been nominated for the Libertarian Party. And unlike Joe Biden, who is a lifelong politician, and Donald Trump, who is, Donald Trump, Jo Jorgensen is a senior lecturer in psychology at Clemson University. Before going into academia, she also worked in business, successfully running a company called Digitech. She has previously been the vice presidential candidate back in 1996. As you can imagine, as a libertarian, she's not very happy about what's going on at the moment in terms of the assault on our liberties, as she describes it. Very much against bailing out businesses as well as banks and anything else really. Mike, you once met some libertarians, or some American libertarians in was it Orange County in California? What do you think to the Libertarian Party's chances, relatively speaking, given the other candidates that they'll appear to be up against?
I undertook the personal sacrifice of visiting the Libertarian Party of Newport Beach, of Orange County, California, in Newport Beach. That's a really tough gig to do. There is miles of golden sunny beach. It is always sunny. There is loads of great places to visit, and you're not far from Disney. It's close to the airport, but it was a struggle, and I was prepared to do it for the cause. They're a great bunch, and Jo Jorgensen looks pretty good as well. She was quite a credible candidate, which the Libertarians haven't always had. Slight worries about the vice presidential candidate. Don't know whether you've looked at Spike Cohen. He's ran on a manifesto, and he appears to have been elected separately to that position within the party. He's got some perfectly sound libertarian views. You own yourself, you own your labour. Your labour is your property, and the product of your labour is your own property. Good sound libertarian views. Free ponies, mandatory toothbrushing, zombie power, killing baby Hitler, not so much. And I promise if he'd elected and didn't achieve those within 100 days, he will be replaced by Baby Yoda. Does suggest a credibility gap within the Libertarian Party, and it is unfortunate they've elected a woman to run, which obviously neither of the main 2 parties have done. The Libertarians will almost certainly finish third in this election, as they have the last few. So they'll get some publicity doing that. They will no doubt sink millions of dollars into the campaign, but they've then rather gone and shot themselves in the foot by electing this Spike chap who no doubt is quite brilliant. He's a podcaster, which already tells you something you need to know about the bloke. I won't say what, but yeah, just it's a shame. They have a reasonably credible chance of reaching the 5% they want this year. I don't imagine the Greens going too far. The main person running for them is someone who's formerly run for the Socialist Party in the USA. So I'm not sure they're going to put on such a credible gig. And obviously everyone will get behind Biden to beat Trump. Interestingly, on Biden, despite the comment we've talked about earlier, he's running behind Hillary Clinton in terms of African American votes, and it was Donald's increase of African American votes for the Republicans that is much credited for winning the last election. So, yeah, that'll be an interesting to see how that pans out. But yeah, the Libertarians, if they get 5%, I think they suddenly get onto a lot of debate stages. They suddenly get nominated in a lot more states, and that'll be fantastic for them if it happens.
Well, it could certainly get interesting if that vice presidential candidate you talked about got to take part in some live network television vice presidential debates. Could brighten things up, couldn't it, Alasdair?
It could, and I think that might be the only thing that could brighten it up, given the other two candidates. Although I'm sure Trump will no doubt say some inappropriate but interesting things that the media can jump on. But I think for me, it's the money. It's just how much money people pour into the elections in America. It's quite frankly frightening. There's a huge just bombardment with adverts on TV and around the country, and you just can't get away from it. And yet they seem to have forgotten one of the key things of marketing, which is you need a product that will sell and that people will buy. And I think from what you've just described, none of the three parties are really something I'd want to.
It's going to be an interesting few months there. Well, Alasdair, it would be wrong of us to invite you onto the podcast without asking you some questions about your time in politics. Mike, I think you've got a few questions for Alasdair.
I have indeed. So, Alasdair, thanks again for coming on. So, first I want to ask you is what first got you involved in politics?
Well, thanks very much, Mike and Dan, and thanks very much for having me on today's podcast. It's been really interesting so far. I think I was always interested in politics. It was something that was always discussed when I was growing up. But I think the first campaign that really caught my attention was the No to ID campaign back in 2004, when the Labour government were planning to issue us all ID cards. And while I was very much opposed to it back then, I think probably my views might have changed since. But that was probably the first real campaign that I thought, I wanted to support, writing to MPs, petitions, promoting it online and all that kind of thing. In terms of party politics, that was much more recent, really, actually. It was probably the 2015 general election that really motivated me to get involved in party politics. Having grown up and lived in Scotland for some of my life, including under an SNP administration there, I'd seen the damage that they'd done to Scotland, whether it was the health service, with education, or even just the government's finances. And I was quite frankly terrified of the idea of the SNP propping up a Labour administration in Westminster. So that's really what motivated me to get out there, start leafleting, start delivering, start having conversations on doorsteps, and trying to convince people that what they really needed to do was re-elect Conservative MPs and a Conservative government.
And to that end, of course, you ended up standing in the 2018 local elections in West Thornton. Now, I think it's fair to say West Thornton isn't a hotbed of conservatism. How was that experience for you?
Well, I hadn't actually planned to stand in the 2018 local elections. I was a very late addition as a candidate there. I replaced someone who had to drop out as they weren't able to stand anymore. And I think probably the most memorable or interesting thing about standing there that I can remember is really when one of the local papers, published and talked about the results and said that I'd received 6,000 votes rather than 600, which would have meant I'd have topped the ward. And that would have been great, but sadly, I think it's very unlikely to happen anytime soon in West Thornton. Much more interesting for me was the rest of the campaign. It was being fought on new boundaries in Croydon, so everything was new and a bit different, and there were a lot of seats in play that we thought could go either way. And I think probably one of the things that I always reflect back on during elections is really just how disappointing it is when you're speaking to people. They say they're unhappy about how the council might be doing things, but then also say they aren't going to vote. And that for me is probably the real sad and depressing part of being involved in local politics, when people just don't want to use the vote that people have fought so hard for us all to have many years ago.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say as well, had you got 6,000 votes in West Thornton Ward, I think it is reasonable that some sort of inquiry would be undertaken, since I'm fairly sure there aren't 6,000 people in the ward. But yes, it's a good point. Okay, so of course, around that time, you're also the chairman of the Croydon Conservative Federation. You've since moved on from that role. How did you get that role? How did you find it? And tell us a little bit about it.
So most local parties have a sort of a structure where you've got elected representatives from across the membership, and then individuals that take different roles, and then in the Conservatives' case for Croydon, a chairman and two deputies working across the whole borough. So I'd been on the local executive for a number of years, firstly elected there by my local branch, and then I did a couple of different roles as an officer of the Federation. And I think during that time, I'd really sort of demonstrated to people the positive contributions I could make. That hopefully I would have been a competent and successful chair, and steer through some of the projects and some of the change that people wanted to see, and hopefully bring it to a good conclusion. And I was also very keen to see some change. And I think, for me, I am really keen that members of political parties are engaged. I think far too often the wider membership isn't engaged, either locally or nationally. And so that was something I was very keen to do. And I think people were initially very keen of the theory of that idea, but perhaps less so keen when they saw in practice what that might actually mean in terms of what we should have been doing differently that we perhaps hadn't been doing before.
Yes, indeed. And one of the things, and I guess this might relate to members' feelings, whilst you were chair, you signed a protest against the misuse of party funds on a propaganda campaign backing the withdrawal agreement. I believe that was published in Conservative Home, among others. How did that go down with some of the people within the party, and both perhaps for and against?
Well, it was certainly a very interesting time to be the Croydon Conservative Federation party chairman, in the middle of the Brexit negotiations with Theresa May as Prime Minister, and all the various different proposals that were coming out from Number 10, the Chequers deal and everything else. And yes, I certainly put my head above the parapet and made my views, and indeed the views of our members, well known. In terms of that specific letter, I'd surveyed local members. We asked their views, which I thought was a fairly uncontroversial thing to do, but it hadn't really been done before. And members responded overwhelmingly. There were hundreds of responses within 24 hours. It was really quite amazing. And so I knew from that local members were not just incredibly positive for Brexit and wanting to leave, but also a proper Brexit. So I think the idea of spending money both on having a leaflet printed with the party funds nationally, and then using and asking our local volunteers and deliverers to deliver it, was really something that I didn't think chimed with what our local members were thinking. But I think in terms of, there was certainly controversy about that letter and me signing it, but it often wasn't on the leave or remain lines. It was much more about whether, some people saw it very much as rocking the boat. People were also conscious that, our previous MP and a number of other party members locally worked in Number 10. And so perhaps they would have preferred that I raised my concerns more privately and more directly with CCHQ and others. But I very much disagreed with that view. I think it's very important that local party members are asked their opinion, that they are listened to, and they are represented. Whether that is both privately, as I did do in a number of different forums and ways, but also publicly when clearly you aren't being listened to. And I think that was the real theme during my time as the local party chairman. Members in the party did not feel they were being listened to, either by the top of the Conservative Party, but most importantly, not by those that were in Number 10, and particularly Theresa May. So I stand absolutely by signing those letters, making those views known, and I think I got far more support for having done that than I ever did get complaints from people being a bit unhappy that I'd spoken out.
No, that's fantastic, and it proved true. I mean, you think a year ago now, we would have just gone through the European elections, and the Conservatives had a huge defeat there. Brexit Party doing particularly well. I think Conservative parties were way dropping down the polls at this time, and it's about a year ago Theresa May resigned. And you look at the end of last year, where an 80-seat majority was delivered for a party that had been in power for 10 years already, a fantastic result, and it kind of reflects the views of members that you amplified there. So it definitely paid off what you did. Coming back to Croydon, or talking about politics more generally, what are your thoughts, and we've touched on some of it, what are your thoughts more generally on politics in the borough?
I mean, I think reflecting back on some of the comments I've made earlier, in many ways, one of Croydon's problems is the fact it is effectively a two-party competition. It is incredibly partisan and entirely divided, with the Conservatives in the south primarily and Labour in the north, and everyone fights over Croydon Central, much as they do in the Westminster MP elections, they do for the council elections as well. And there's just so many things about Croydon politics that are just absolutely mad, I think. You've got the crazy position where when they were in power, the Conservatives, the Conservative Croydon administration, built more council houses than Labour, this administration, are under Labour. And I think people just don't understand that actually you can have a Conservative government in Westminster and then a Labour council. And I think there's a real interesting thing there about actually educating people more about how the political system in the UK works, so they can understand the different levels of government and who is representing them at those different levels. And it does sort of mean for me that with people not always understanding who's in charge and thinking it's maybe the other party, the other colour, that, Tony Newman and Labour, they do feel a bit like Teflon sometimes, because they're not properly held to account by the electorate. And I think if there was much more awareness within, the population and residents of Croydon about what was going on in the council, that would hopefully lead to some really positive change. And I'm particularly conscious that, we don't have a local media and local press really to talk of in Croydon anymore. So the opportunities for people to hear things and understand what's going on are really quite limited. So for me, it's really just quite sad. And I think overall, the people of Croydon deserve better than what we're currently seeing.
Yes, absolutely. That lack of local media and the loss of the things like the Croydon Citizen are a real bitter blow for the town, because there isn't any route to market for much of what's going on. You're absolutely right there. But you've been involved in politics for a number of years now, and I've seen you out leafleting myself, and you've been on the campaign trail many times. What surprised you most about getting actively involved in politics, and have you got any interesting or fun stories from the campaign trail?
I mean, I think the main reflection I'd take away and I want to share is that it's actually quite fun. Getting engaged in a political party can be really enjoyable. And then there's different ways to get involved from there. You can go to interesting fundraisers where you've got interesting people speaking, and hopefully get to ask them some questions and understand their views in a very different setting to what you might see either in the written press or the media on TV. Um, but also, I think some people have this idea that to be involved in politics, everyone involved must be really quite odd and a bit strange, and that's really not true at all. I mean, I think I probably don't have anything particularly interesting or fun from the campaign trail. You've got the usual sort of trying to gingerly avoid the barking dog that wants to bite off your fingers when you're delivering leaflets and all those kind of issues. But I think my wider reflection would be on really the state of the political parties and having met people and spoken to people both around the country from both the Conservatives and the Labour side, is actually that thinking about our politicians and running the country and everything around that, that actually political parties are often quite disorganized. Thinking about the Conservatives in particular, you've got some pockets of great practice and really good practice, but often the parties locally and indeed nationally quite often are run in very old-fashioned, ineffective and inefficient ways. And particularly from the Conservative side, when you think about all the professionals involved, they would never in their day job work in their job like that or run their teams, organizations, and or their businesses like that. And yet, when it comes to the political party, it's often done to a very different standard and level. And I think that's something I'd really love to see improve. And I also talked a lot earlier about members being involved. And I think Labour perhaps have the opposite problem there. Members vote on everything in Labour. And typically those members, as we've seen in recent elections, definitely aren't representative of the country as a whole. So you've got these real big party political machines that just aren't working very well. And that, I think, is a really depressing situation for me, that when you think about the fact that these are the political parties with the people in them who want to run the country, and that their own parties could be run much better. I would really hope that the reason they aren't is that people are focusing on running the country and trying to get elected. But it would be nice perhaps for a bit more time to be spent getting those things firing on all cylinders. And I think, finding ways to engage local residents more. It should be much more of a two-way communication. It shouldn't just be dropping off the leaflets through people's doors and annoying them if you're doing it every week, as you are in the middle of a general election campaign or a local council campaign. And I think some of the things we've done that probably are the most interesting is when you run the public meetings, you get the people in. And you just hear some terrible stories of where either the local council or national government have let people down. And you can do some real positive, good things for them. People can go away and get those problems solved. But that does require much more of a two-way communication. And I really think that is something that both political parties in Croydon, but also all political parties in the UK should be focusing a lot more on.
Yes, it's interesting just how small often the political party effort is, how relatively little money numbers of people provide almost all of that infrastructure. It will shock a lot of people, I think. Well, thanks ever so much for that. Just before we go on this, any other thoughts you'd like to leave us with about politics or really anything in general?
I mean, I think for me, in terms of politics, it would be to get involved. As you said, people would be amazed at how few people are actually behind the party machines, particularly locally, that produce all the literature and deliver it. It doesn't matter what your age is, what your background is, what type of person you are. Get involved. You will find people that hopefully you like and can get along with and have really interesting conversations with. I would particularly encourage people with different views to what we see on the media. We're forever having people talking about climate change and getting to net zero and lots of socialists and everything. And we need some more voices for the ordinary British person. We know from recent elections that the climate change warriors and the lefty socialists are not representative of the country as a whole. Even it's Remainers versus Leavers. So I would really encourage more normal, rational individuals to get involved. Have a voice, share their voice. Personally, I've met some really great people, both locally in the Croydon Conservatives and nationally in the wider party. And for me, when I first got involved in 2015 locally, I didn't quite expect to be fighting two further general elections within 4 years. But, that's, I think, just also an illustration of how unexpected it can be. But it can be a lot of work, but it is good fun. So I think no matter what your age, background, experience, or any political views, I would really just encourage people to get involved and make their voice known.
Oh, thanks for that, Alasdair. The fascinating insight into what it's like to get involved in a political party and to politics in Croydon. Well, Mike, we're still in lockdown, unfortunately, but we've got a few good pieces on our website that people can spend some time reading if they fancy it. What have we got on this week?
Yeah, so as part of our ongoing series of speaking to libertarian parties around Europe and basically people fighting for freedom, we speak to, and I apologise to the gentleman immediately, Baldwin Collard of Parti Libertarian, the Libertarian Party of Belgium. So we're speaking to we've got an interview there with the Belgian Libertarians. Really interesting again. Love getting these from across Europe and getting a view of people who we share an awful lot in common with in terms of our political stance, but come from a different culture and a different country and a different perspective. Again, slightly mixed views on the European Union. I'll just quote a couple of bits from the article. We do not want a bureaucratic construction imposed on us from above. No federalism, no New Deal, no Eurobonds. European construction must be done from below through natural exchange and the mutual interest between individuals. Now, I'd very much agree with that statement, but it's not sort of anti-EU rhetoric that you may be, or views that you may be here in this country. Goes on to say, and something that names people might remember, the positions of MEPs like Syed Kamal and Daniel Hannan have often been a reminder to the values of individual freedom. They will be greatly missed. So they're losing some of those politicians in the EU they think's a real loss for us. So have a read of that article. We've also got an article from Maureen Martin of the Christian Parties Alliance. Now, the Christian Parties Alliance have stood quite a lot in Croydon. They're a Christian party, as you might expect. And she's got some really interesting views on the lockdown and particularly how it intersects with faith. Now, that's a pretty unpopular thing to talk about in the media here. We don't really talk a lot about churches and faith in this country. There are still a huge number of people who identify as Christians and of other faiths in this country. Religion is a really important part of our society, but it's not fashionable, so you don't hear about it. Great to hear from Maureen here. She makes a really interesting point that I certainly noted with me, and it's not that I necessarily personally agree with all this, but I do see the real problem with the challenges here. So right now you can have an abortion but not a baptism, buy a car but not a votive candle, go to a supermarket but not a sanctuary, get a divorce but not get married, break the law but not receive absolution. It's time to reopen the churches. And it is interesting the things you can do versus what's been part of our society, frankly, for millennia that you can't do. Moving on from that, we have Andrew Bentz of the SDP. So the SDP is the party you remember from your youth. The Social Democrats, they are a pro-Brexit party. They still exist. And they're a left-leaning party, but very much anti-woke, very much pro-Brexit. And I think, I have to say, really in tune with an awful lot of people's views in Britain. Andrew talks about some of the challenges of setting up a party, and particularly in a time of lockdown. He talks about the fact that, and I'll quote him, Nigel Farage is again speaking for millions of us as he single-handedly campaigns against the latest wave of illegal immigrants from the South Coast. The criminals are ably supported by both the French and British border forces. Millions have viewed his videos, and there's virtually no mainstream media coverage. Not a single leading politician has commented. And that difference between those in charge and perhaps what people on the street feel is, or not on the street at the moment, is really telling. And Andrew goes on to talk about the fact that perhaps some of these different parties need to work together. We won't always agree, but we need to come together. So again, really interesting, well worth a read, and hopefully keeps you entertained whilst you're out enjoying the sun next week.
No, excellent pieces. Well worth a visit to the website. Well, if you'd like to write for the website yourself, or if there's any stories that you'd like us to cover, please do contact us via the Twitter at Croydon Const, via our Facebook page. Go to our website, which is croydonconstitutionalist.uk, or via email, croydonconstitutionalists@gmail.com. Thank you to everyone for listening to the podcast. Please do subscribe, and please do subscribe to our pubcast as well, where we, when we're allowed to go to the pub, we like to go and have a pint and have a little chat about things. We've done a virtual pubcast, so do please give that a listen. We've also got a YouTube channel that you may want to go over and subscribe to. We've put videos on there and other audio pieces that when they're not just doing podcasts, but obviously we can only do podcasts just at this moment in time. Do please like, share, and please do consider leaving a review. It's always good to get feedback, and it does help other people to find the podcast. Well, finally, just like to say thank you to Alasdair for joining us and giving us some of his fascinating views about Croydon politics and the local Conservative Party. So thank you, Alasdair.
And thank you, Dan and Mike, for having me.
And thank you to everybody else for listening. So until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Stay safe, everybody.